They're jacked with Pepsi.
I'm there for the pack out. You just got to pack me in.
Committed to the boat early on. Like I love getting close and putting up.
You cover a range of stuff on here too, right? Like
We call this the THP World Headquarters.
My grandpa Roy Weatherby.
I came into like that golden little pocket where there was like 4 or 5 different bowls. Just
You're Canadian? We're doing a Canadian podcast?
My name's Douglas Boze.
I'm Robbie Denning.
Roy Candy.
Well, Doug, how you been doing?
Good, Derek. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. Just trying to plan and get a bunch of gear ready for where Kevin and I are going with Muck. Gonna go on a little spring bear extravaganza trip to Saskatchewan. So I'm just
Nice.
trying to do what I can to get thermocells together and tick repellent gear and all that crap. I got to throw a new string on my bow, and I just built another 12 arrows. Yeah, so just busy, you know?
Is it going to be a bait situation?
Yeah,
or spot and
yeah.
stock, or
Yeah, I'm hoping to, I'm really looking forward to this because I got lots of questions because I hunt elk a lot, but I'm just usually hunting bears as a byproduct of hunting elk, calling them by accident. But I'm hoping to get out in Alberta, do a little bit of spot and stalk, and then in May, end of May, we're gonna go out and Muck he's got a bunch of bait runs that he's gonna be setting up, and we got a couple tree stands. It's gonna be a good time. Really looking forward to it. Pete's coming too,
Nice.
and I think Landon. So it's gonna be it's gonna be like a boys trip.
right on, man. That's
Yeah,
gonna be
it's gonna be
awesome.
pretty
A lot of
good.
fun.
Well, Doug, you're not new to the show, but do you want to give a little intro just for new listeners?
Sure. My name is Douglas Boze. I live in Washington State in the US of A. I am a published author, not just self-published. I'm actually published by a New York publisher. I have a book out called The Ultimate Guide to Black Bear Hunting. I write every issue for Bear Hunting Magazine. I am submitting an article that will be published in Cat Hunter Mag here coming right up. I've been a bear hunter for, 20 years plus. And all my stuff in this state is spot and stock. There's no baiting, no hounds. And so that's how I was brought up hunting bears, and that's my effective way of doing it, along with predator calling. And I've hunted bears in Washington and Alaska. I've hunted in other states, but for other creatures. And that's about it.
Yeah, that's our current situation where I'm at too, is in Southern Alberta. You're not allowed to bait, so it's all spot and stalk, big terrain, glassing them up, trying to make moves on them. So let's get right into it. That's your forte, right? So, what is something that when you're starting out each year, what are you looking for when you're putting together a new plan? Maybe it's a new area you want to look at, or you're going back to Old Faithful, but something changes. What kind of terrain features are you looking for, and what do you usually cue in on to make a plan when you're going to make a new hunt for the year?
I try to figure out what the bear are eating in that location that time of year. So, bears don't just eat berries in one spot the whole year. It breaks up from month to month, week to week, sometimes day to day. And so what I like to do is I like to figure out what they're eating that specific time I'm going to be hunting. And that can be anywhere from, tearing up stumps and eating grubs and ants to blackberries that are in, to skunk cabbage and green grass in the spring. So if you've heard me talk before, you've heard me say it 1,000 times, find the food and find the bears. If you can find an area that there's food that they're hitting with minimal human interaction, you're going to end up spotting some bears probably. So first and foremost, I look for food. And secondly, I look for like thick cover, brush, areas that they feel safe. And then I try to work those edges of the brush, edges of the tree line, that type of stuff. But food is key with bears. Always think food with bear.
Yeah, that's something I've always tried to cue in on. Sometimes that can be quite difficult once the snow is completely melted off. So what are you looking for early spring? Are you just trying to find that green line, or what are you looking for?
Yeah, so lots of times I'll start kind of up high and at the snow line, and then kind of work my way down and figure out what elevation the bear are kind of hitting at, because they tend to kind of be in a certain elevation in the spring. But I'm looking for sunny hillsides, grassy areas, that nice chartreuse green color. Um, I look for skunk cabbage, and if you're not familiar with that, you'll find that in swampy areas, but it's got this kind of a bulbous yellow flower that comes out, that almost pokes out first, and then these huge broad leaves that look like almost like lettuce. If a fern was lettuce, it's the way it kind of looks. It's got this wide, broad leaf that's about a foot, 2 foot long. And when you hit it with a stick, it stinks, and so then you know you found skunk cabbage because it
Yeah.
smells like a skunk. Um, but yeah, that elevation and green grass is really what I'm looking for locally in early spring. And along that, I'm also looking for scat, right? So if I'm finding green grass, but I'm not finding any tracks in the mud or the snow or no scat, I'll go up or down depending on the situation and elevation to try to find an area with food and sign.
What do they tip? How do the bears that you've seen, how are they responding to pressure, like human recreational activity? Are they just getting pushed out of there, or are they pretty resilient to human activity?
I think they're pretty resilient. So there's a spot that I hunt that I call Paradise, and I've written about it in my book, and I've hunted that area for 15 years, and there's people through there all the time, not necessarily in the brush or in the trees or whatever, but it's a common area for people to kind of go for a walk with their dogs or whatever, and they might not travel the same area as I do, but there's people through there, and I think bears, especially in that area or areas like that, they're kind of used to the human smell, but they're in the brush, they're covered, they feel safe. Um, and so if I walk through, it's no different just because I'm hunting. They just think I smell like the rest of them, and they're pretty accustomed to it. Now, if you go out into the woods further out into the national forest or wildlife areas, to me, those bear are a lot more wary because it's an unfamiliar smell, right? So it's something that they're not used to, and they don't like it, and they'll skate off. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be careful of your scent in areas like Paradise or hiking trails and stuff like that. You should definitely keep an eye on that. But I've met several bears that have been too laxed in their situational awareness, and I think part of that is due to humans kind of walking through, and I'm using that to my advantage.
Hmm. What about your preferred technique? Are you trying to get up and glass them primarily, or are you just covering areas that you know they're going to be in there in a high density?
I do a lot of walking, so and it kind of depends where I'm at. So like in Western Washington, where I live, it's pretty thick. And so I don't even bring a spotter scope with me. I mean, I'll bring binos with me so I can kind of look down roads or through clear cuts and tree lines and stuff like that, but I don't bring a spotter scope because it's so thick, it just wouldn't do you any good.
Hmm.
Now, if I'm going to Eastern Washington where it's much more arid and open and they've got, like pine trees and a lot of sage and stuff like that, I'll bring a spotter scope for that. But my main strategy is I'll walk old logging cuts, ones that have been decommissioned, that's got the grass on the road that no one really goes on. I like to walk those and cut for sign, and then once I find fresh sign, I slow to a real slow walk, and most of the time I will hear bear before I see him. So
Hmm.
like not early spring, but a couple of weeks or a month into it, they start to strip those trees of the bark for the cambium layer, and you can hear those guys, from quite a ways away, because they're just tearing those trees up, making all sorts of racket. And bears will be noisy if they're comfortable. They're snorting, they're walking around. They have no reason to be quiet, and so they make noise like bears do, and that is a key. I often hear bear well before I ever see him.
And are you just traveling benches, or are you hooking up on trails? what do they prefer? Do they prefer more open terrain, or do they just kind of transition through thick cover into these more benched out areas?
In the spring, they like that more open stuff, but they like it close to cover. So the reason they like it open is because things are growing once the sun hits it, right? So
Yeah.
if things are in a thick canopy, like in a thick forest, not much sunlight gets down there. Even in the summer, it's a lot of mature forests are pretty bare when you get in there. There's not a lot of growth. So they like the open patches. And if you can travel in a marsh or on a marsh's edge, someplace that's kind of open that gets sunlight, even one spot where I hunt, the bears have actually killed a bunch of trees in the area from peeling, and it has opened up. This is kind of a swampy area too, but it's opened up big patches of sunlit areas in probably a 500-yard radius. And so there's little teeny patches of grass all over in this area, but it's surrounded by cover. That is just like money because there's always bear in there. They hit those little grass spots and no one's bothering them and they feel protected. And so I'll cruise through there and stumble on bears all the time.
Mhm. Now, do you see any difference between juvenile bears and those big dominant bears? And is it just they'll take the prime real estate because they're the most dominant, or you see it kind of widely dispersed just depending on human pressure?
There's definitely body movements that are different with juvenile compared to mature boars. And you'll see it definitely if you hang out at a bait site. Younger bears, they kind of come in and they're cautious and they look nervous. They're like kind of looking around and they have a slow kind of movement to them. They're nervous, and there's good reason for that because a big boy could come by and mess them up, and they don't want to get messed up. The bigger guys kind of just come in and they have a strut to them. They're broad-shouldered, they have kind of a swagger to them. They're heavier. They almost kind of waddle or have a John Wayne kind of walk to him, not necessarily. I'm not calling John Wayne a waddler, but he has a swagger to him.
Yeah, he's a big guy.
Those mature boars, that's the same way. So I think that younger bears get pushed out, and they get pushed out in like kind of crappier areas, right? I mean, there's food for them to eat. That's not the money spots, because the money spots, if there's a high bear population, those are kind of taken over by the mature boars. But it's a big area too. There's not 60,000 deer or a bear in a square mile, so there's a lot of room and stuff like that. But I'm sure there's pushing a pecking order to that.
So if you're trying to specifically target the biggest bears in an area, what are you queuing in on? What are you looking for? Is it just the same features and it's just a numbers game of just finding and locating? Or is it you have those areas that are going to hold the biggest bears?
I do have areas that I know that holds bear, but when I'm looking for like the biggest bears in the area, I'll look for scat to kind of tell me the size of the bears in the area. Now that's not, a for sure thing, but it stands to reason. A 400-pound man probably craps bigger than a 120-pound man. And the same would go for bear, right? So I'll be looking for that. I'll look for bear scratching, bear markings on trees. One sign that I look for is like on alders and stuff. Younger alders, bears will stand up and they'll scratch their back and they'll grab the branch and like bend it over their shoulder or bite it. So I kind of just look for more unobvious signs. Those scratch marks, rub trees, stomp trails, which I don't see much of in my area, but I know others like down in California and stuff, they really do up in Alaska too. Yeah, and it is a numbers game too, right? So like with fishing, the more you cast out, the more likely you are to get a big hog underneath a log, right? And that's bass. Same way with bear hunting. It's you got to put in the time and kind of figure out areas that are greening up, that have cover, that bigger bears like, or that just bears in general like. And on a side note, I have found that bears can be really tolerant of each other too when there's plenty of food. So, in the fall, I'm getting a little off topic, but I've seen several bears in blueberry fields, and there's so much food that they don't don't really care. I mean, they're just eating and leaving each other alone, so they seem pretty tolerant. And even what was it, 3 or 4 years ago, it was a spring bear. It was in the spring. I wasn't hunting, but I went up this logging road, and there was like 4 bears within 200 yards of each other, and they were eating like Devil's Club and stuff like that. So they were very tolerant of each other, and I don't think they were like a sow and 3 cubs. It was one was a big chocolate, and the other 3 were black, and they were kind of all dispersed. But I think a lot of food lets them be tolerant with space and each other.
So when you're traveling these areas and you're hitting these more wide open meadows, like how much do you use calling? Do you use calling when you're out there?
Oh yeah, I use calling all the time. Especially if I get bored. Well, not if I get bored. If I see a spot that looks quote unquote bearish to me, like it looks like it holds bear, but it's so thick that I'm not gonna see one. It'd have to
Yeah.
come out and shake my hand. I'll climb up on a big log pile, or I'll find a spot to where, all right, if I call, I think a bear might break through cover here, or maybe work that tree line, and I'll predator call, no matter what time of season, like spring, fall, it doesn't matter to me, and try to get that bear loose, try to get it interested. So I think calling works. Calling works especially well when there's less amount of food. So in the early spring, before everything really greens up, and then in the late fall when the berries are dying off and everything else. But people will say, well, it's the calves haven't dropped yet, or the fawns haven't dropped yet. You shouldn't call in the spring. Well, bears don't have a calendar that says, oh, the fawns
No.
are dropping this date. It's a distress sign or a
Yeah.
distress signal to peak that predator response. And I call a lot.
And that being said, how are you calling and setting up and getting those shooting lanes? Like, are you really cautious? Like, obviously, we always got to worry about wind. That it doesn't matter what we're hunting, but are you really focusing in on that? Like, how much distance and like cover and visual cues? Like when you're entering in an area, like say if the wind is shit, are you going to loop all the way around, or are you just going to try and navigate that as a bear comes in and you get that first visual and then move?
I try to set up so I don't like to call when it's really windy or when it's really rainy. And the reason for that is like it just kind of buries your sound, right? So the
Yeah.
more calm it is or colder or whatever, your sound carries farther. So I like kind of calmer days. With the wind, naturally you don't want to walk into a canyon with the wind at your back and then try to set up because, things they're gonna smell you. So you need to consider that. I won't necessarily go all the way around somewhere to call to avoid the wind, but I try to use it as I set up. I like the wind either left to right, right to left, kind of a crosswind, real light, or I do actually want it at my back, blowing toward my shooting lane, and that might sound counterintuitive to some people, but I learned this from Randy Anderson, the great coyote hunter. He got me into predator calling, and he has a ton of DVDs called Calling All Coyotes, and he would call with the wind either crossways like I like or down your shooting lane. And the whole idea is if the wind is to your face and blowing away from you to your back, predators, coyotes and bears included, they will try to circle and then they'll come behind you and sniff you out and then take off. But if they try to circle with the wind in front of you, they walk into that shooting lane, right? And so that's the reasoning behind that. And so when I set up, whether it be kind of a long shot in eastern Washington or a close shot in western Washington, I want to be kind of elevated if I can. Pile of logs, anything like that. Even a log cut or something that looks down into a clear cut. I want something at my back, if at all possible, for safety reasons. So sometimes I'll tuck myself up against a tree or a pile of stumps or brush or something to let me know that my back is protected. And then I'll call, but I'll be ready, right? So I'll call for an hour, but things can happen quick. I've had bears come in within a minute or two, and I've had them wait for an hour and a half. So when I start calling, I'm ready to go. And so I'm sitting correctly. I've kind of figured out how I'm going to place a shot, how my body's going to situate itself. But before I call too, I'll sit there and I'll kind of try to memorize what I'm looking at. I'll look at the stumps, how things look. I'll give it, 5-10 minutes for the area to calm down, for the birds to kind of start singing again, for things just to kind of mellow out, and then I'll start calling. I'll start my set. So.
And when you're calling, are you calling continuously? Or like what's the frequency?
So I'll tell people I call for an hour and I'll call continuously, but when I say that, I don't mean I'm making noise like all the time. I'll make noise for 2, 3, 4, or 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I'll pause for 30 seconds to a minute and I'll listen because like I said before, lots of times I hear bear long before I see him. So I'll pause for a minute or two. Then I'll start calling again. And it doesn't have to be constant, but just some sort of noise.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell people that when you stop calling, I have witnesses too. Bears, when the music stops, the bears lots of times will stop. And when you start that call back up, they start walking toward you or running toward you or however they are, and they can lose interest quick. So don't pause for a long time. And keeping your head like, hey, if I'm calling across the canyon, I think there's a bear over there in that draw with trees. How long is it going to take for that bear to walk from those pile of trees all the way to my shooting lane? It might be an hour. So you got to give the bear time. It's not like coyotes. You call 15, 30 minutes, 45 max, and you're on to the next set. Bear, you want to call for at least an hour, hour and 15, and then wait another 10, 15, 20 minutes because sometimes they'll come in after you've called and things have quieted down. They come to check it out. As far as the set goes, as far as the noise goes, I like to start off quiet, and the whole idea is to think of your sound as when you're a kid. At least when I was a kid, I'd take a rock and I'd throw it in a puddle, and you'd have the little waves that come out. The bigger the rock, the wider the waves, the bigger the splash. When you call, that sound is kind of going out, and then the louder you call, the further and further it goes out. So I'd like to call quiet first to see if anything's close by and not to blow things out of the area. And then as time goes on, my frequency or the stress level of the call goes up and the sound does too. And so you can almost compare it to like a skateboarder and a half pipe. So the skateboarder might be at the top and then he drops down and goes up at the end of the call, and that would be like the peak. So at the very end of the entire set is when you're loudest, most raspy and crazy sounding. And I will either just die off and so I'll just completely stop at say an hour in, or I will kind of peter out like I'm slowly dying off, and so my voice or the sound of the call will just slowly go down and then die off. So there's kind of two ways to end it. Those are my two.
And how do you determine when an area is blown out? You're just like you're covering areas, like are you staying pretty mobile and you're hitting valley and like ridge lines and valleys, or are you just getting in an area and hunkering down, walking terrain, making calls? Like how do you approach, like how much area do you cover before you decide, okay, it's ready to move? This area is obviously I'm not seeing what I'm wanting to see, and I move on to the next area.
It really depends on the territory or the terrain, I should say, and the weather too. So in Eastern Washington, I'll use it as an example, that sound carries further. And so when I'm done with a set, I will probably walk much further than I would in Western Washington, because in Western Washington we have trees and brush and all this crap, and the sound doesn't carry as far. So I might, over here in Western Washington, I might only walk maybe 1,000 yards or something like that down to another spot. Like I if I'm calling down into a draw or something, I won't go down into that draw and call further. I might walk 1,000 yards to the left or right,
Yeah.
And then start calling again if it looks good. But in Eastern Washington, that sound really carries. There's large little canyons and draws, and that stuff goes quite a ways. So you might you might only call into a canyon once, and then walk up a saddle and then call on the backside of that canyon or something to that effect. So it really kind of just depends. Um, and I won't call a spot, day after day. I'll call a spot once, and then I'll let it rest for, if I'm camping in the area or something like that. I might let it rest for 2 or 3 days or something like that, and then I'll come back. Um, but things change all the time. Bears
Yeah.
come in and out of that area. They might not be educated. There just might not have been a bear there at the time. So don't worry about calling, maybe even once every other day or once a day. If you're camping out and you want to, and a valley looks good and there's sign and stuff, keep at it. So
What about how they respond to like weather changes? Like I know you said that largely this depends on weather conditions. What about like wind, rain, heat? What like I know for me like rain, my dad has had really good success with rain. They'll as soon as that rain stops, the bears come out because it really stops their activity. But what have you seen for rain and extreme heat? Like I know it can get pretty hot here in Canada, even in the spring, we'll get these kind of like a heat wave. Uh, what do you see as far as bear activity? Is that really uh, stop it to be just like the morning and evening, or what are you looking for in different changing weather conditions?
I usually don't hunt bear when it's raining out. And I like your dad's example of after it rains that the bears kind of pop out. I feel the same way about black-tailed deer. It's like the crappiest weather. You want to be out there. So once it dies out, those blacktail just seem to pop out, everywhere.
Hmm.
Um, haven't had much luck in the rain. In the extreme heat, like in August or whatever, I'll be working creek bottoms because A, I'm hot and I like to be down where it's cool, and B, I know that they're hot because they're wearing a black coat, right?
Yeah.
So they want to be down by the water.
Yeah.
Bears like water. They want to
Yeah.
cool down, and so I'll work those areas. Heck, one of the spots that I like to hunt's got, it's an old creek bottom. It's got some open pools. I'll go down there and just sit in the pool and wait for bear to come strolling down the creek bed. Um, so in the heat, I definitely like to find water spots, cool draws, shaded areas, anywhere that the bears can get out of the heat, especially midday. Now in August, I'll go out early mornings or later in the evenings. That's when they seem to really pop out, and that goes with about any game animal, but bears especially, it seems. Midday, I'm looking for cool draws. As far as the fall goes, I just try to avoid really windy days and really rainy days. Other than that, like September, I love hunting bears in September, mid to late September because it's cooler. Um, the weather's still nice, but it's dropping quick. There's still some berries around, so it's just a great time to kind of get out there, and their hides are getting nice. So September is kind of a money time for me.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, where when it's really hot, it can become very difficult. They're usually moving in the morning, and as soon as as soon as that midday hits, they act like they're getting hit with fire. They don't want to be out in the open for too long. Um, yeah, I found the same thing. So, say you're a guy who only has about 1 week to hunt bears in the spring. What types of weather conditions and temperatures are you looking for? Like what is your optimal conditions?
I like clear, quiet days. Um, as far as temperature goes, cooler days are kind of nice. Of course, it's also nice to kind of walk out in the sunshine. I prefer non-windy days that are nice and sunny in the spring. Bears seem to like the springtime, right? They're warm, they got that heavy coat on, but to me they're more active in the spring during midday than they are definitely in the summertime. So if it's a pleasant day outside for me, to me that's a pleasant day outside for the bear too in the spring. And so, and if it's quiet like that, if it's not really windy and stuff, you can hear those bear um, going through the brush or stripping trees. So I prefer just kind of mild. I guess that would be the best word for it. Mild days with mild weather in the spring, in like early April, mid-April, late, and even into late April. Now, something to keep in mind too for new spring bear hunters, if hides are important to you, because hides are important to me, I mean, even if a hide's rubbed, I'd still take it. But if a full thick hide is important to you, the earlier in the spring that you can get that bear tagged, the better, because the more time that goes on, the more likely they are to start um, itching and scratching and rubbing that hide out. And so you could have a bear that looks really nice on one side and then it's bald on the other side, or his face is bald, or you'll see that kind of first. The paws and the face, they really break those hairs off and try to cool down, and I don't blame them for it. But the earlier the better for good hides.
When it gets really hot, what proximity to water? How sensitive are they? Are they hanging out by water? Are they just kind of locally in that area? Or do they start wandering like a pretty long terrain, like coming up trails? Like how much distance do they travel away from water when it gets really hot like that?
Well, I don't know how far they travel away from water, because I'm usually sticking by the water, because I mean, to me, that's where they kind of concentrate when it's hot. I would say that they're probably, I bet you the average bear is probably within 1,000 yards of water. Well, of course, where I'm at, you can hardly go 1,000 yards without running into water somewhere, right? There's
Yeah.
a creek or a swamp or something. I
Yeah.
mean, there's water everywhere. But um, I bet you they're not too far from it. And I stay close. Like I'm usually within 500 yards of water or less, if not right in it. Because I'll work creek beds and I'll walk those creek beds, because a lot of times they're open. I mean, not all the time. They can be pretty brushy and crappy too, but they offer um, an opportunity for signs. So if there's a bear in the area, you're going to see his paw prints or her paw prints in the sand or the gravel. You could find where they've taken a bath in a pool and have come up recently, and there's water all over a log or something like that. So I personally stay close. I think bears stay fairly close, provided that there's not a lot of human interaction and that there's food and stuff for them. But if it's a creek area, water area, I'm sure there's food, there's brush,
Yeah.
there's berries popping up. So
At what point does breeding start playing a role in this? Like at what
so
point does that start affecting the way they're moving and cruising around? Like if you're not seeing what you want to see, like what time frame are you seeing, and how does that kind of start to play a role?
so the rut, when is that? I want to say it's like May and June.
Yeah.
Like, don't quote me on this, but it's something like that. And that is when the boars are cruising. So they're kind of like bucks in that manner. They're looking
Yeah.
for sows and heat. And so if you're looking at an area and you're not seeing much, what I like to do is hop up on a good vantage point. And in those instances, that might help to have a spotter scope, because I'll be looking down at like logging roads, because logging roads are easy to walk. Bears are lazy and it's easy to walk, right? So they like to use those just like we do.
Yeah.
And so they're just kind of cruising, getting a lot of area under their belt, looking for those sows. Um, and so that's a good strategy, is to keep an eye on those logging roads or other open areas that you can view and actually have a chance at intercepting that bear during that time.
And are you seeing them just moving randomly throughout the day, or is it again mostly in the morning or the afternoon, evening?
Kind of randomly throughout the day, and then
Yeah.
as time progresses it gets worse and worse, because they want to find that sow, and so it's food and sex, right? You got to love bears, because I mean it's pretty
Yeah.
basic carnal things that they want. So
Just like humans.
yeah, just look, I mean, you got to love bears.
Yeah.
So that's their other driver, right? It's most of the time it's food, but for that month and a half or so, it's the ladies. So
Right on. Is there any other like secret tips that you would say guys need to focus on or or anything that you would say to someone that's brand new to bear hunting?
Yes, absolutely. So just keep that in your head. Like find the food, find the bears. And I've had a lot of people come up and or message me and they're like, I put on 20 miles and I didn't see a bear and blah blah blah. Slow down. Like you probably walked by I don't know how many bears if you've covered that amount of territory. Just walk slow and listen and use your ears and pay attention to little things. Nature has a story to tell if you're there to listen. So when I'm walking around, I'm looking at any sort of soft spot in the ground for prints. I'm looking for those older trees that are snapped. I'm wondering why this pile of brush looks like a kid took a stick to it and tore it all
Mm-hmm.
apart. I'm looking for bear hair on there. Take your time and just relax and enjoy it. And the other thing too is I had a lot of people say I'm no good at predator calling. I don't sound like anything. Like that's not the point. You're missing the point. The point is to sound like a desperate hurt something, like a raspy, annoying sound, and it doesn't have to be perfect because the bear's not wondering is that perfect. It sounds like something's hurt, and so it wants to go check that out. Um, so I'll use when I'm predator calling, I might use a rabbit squall, but everybody else is using a rabbit squall too lots of times, and so I like to use unconventional sounds, like maybe a javelina sound. I don't even have javelinas in this area, but I'll use that. Um, any sort of oddball sound, coyote in distress. I've called in bears with just a pup distress. I've seen them just come running into that. And that's probably because, not a lot of people use that to call in bears.
Yeah.
So experiment, find what works for you, and just enjoy the time out there. But slow down, pay attention, slow down.
When you're walking through an area, are you almost like still hunting ambush? Like, are you just slowly moving up and then glassing, or are you just listening, mostly just using eyesight, line of sight hunting and listening for those cues, or are you grabbing your binoculars and scanning?
What usually happens on like an afternoon hunt with me is I'll go out and I'll find an area that has food and bear sign and stuff, and I'll just sit there and I'll sit and I'll listen and I'll scan with my binos. And I'll sit there for a couple hours or however long it might be. And if nothing shows up, that's fine. But sometimes I'll sit in that area until dusk when I really think they'll start popping out.
Mm-hmm.
Or I might go find another area and just sit and kind of relax. But when I'm walking, if I come around like a blind corner or something, I'll pause and I'll make sure and glass the old log and cut or the tree line. I do a lot of close glassing, so within a couple hundred yards, um, because bears will work those edges. Predators like edges. Edges get sunlight, so there's berries and stuff like that, or there's more active bugs in those stumps and whatnot. So they kind of work those edges, and lots of times you might miss that unless you're glassing, or they might be down in a ditch. Bears like to hang out down in ditches, eating the grass down below. Binos can be very helpful in that respect. Most of my strategy involves me kind of walking around or sitting and listening. But predator calling is like my go-to money thing that I like to do. And also, like with predator calling, you never know what you're going to get. You can call in coyotes and cougar and bobcat and all sorts of cool stuff. So it's not just for bear. It's an experience to get dive bombed by a hawk. They're trying to take your hat off or something. Like
Yeah.
it adds excitement to an otherwise boring
Yeah.
night. Like if you're like, all right, I'm bored, I'm gonna predator
Yeah.
roll, see what's out there. So
I was just gonna ask that, like, in your area, do you have grizzlies and do you know how they respond when there's grizzlies in the area?
we don't have a lot of grizzlies. We have some up in the North Cascades and some in the northeast corner of Washington from Idaho and stuff. But they're going to be transplanting 25 or 40 of them in the coming years. The federal government's putting them in the North Cascades with the hope of spreading the population. Now I don't know why, since there's no physical barrier between the grizzlies in Canada and BC and
Yeah.
Washington State. They could come down here if they wanted to, but the infinite wisdom of the federal government, they think they need to put them in there. So my experience with grizzlies is pretty limited. I haven't had to deal with them much. So, but I have read and seen that if you're seeing grizzlies, lots of times you're not going to be seeing black bears in that area because grizzlies like to kill and eat black bears, right?
Yeah.
So if a bear's smart, he's kind of a black bear. He's heading out of that area to find something else, greener pastures elsewhere. So
What about early on in the season when they're coming out of their dens? Are they kind of transient in that? Like, do they come in and out of their den, or once they leave the den, do they just commit to roaming? How do you, have you seen that activity?
that I haven't seen it, but I've read on it to where they come out a couple of times. They kind of in the beginning they come out of their den a little bit and forage and kind of hang out, and it takes them a week or something like that, maybe two, before they really come out and they're like, all right, I'm done denning, and they just kind of start meandering. Um, so that's been my experience with that. Most of the time, I think they stay fairly close for about a week or two, and then they just kind of take off. Actually, interesting story. I went and checked my trail cameras the other day in Paradise, as I call it, and I had a bear on there December 17th. Walked right by my trail camera. So I think he's bed up kind of close by. And I haven't had a bear on a camera in December. I don't think ever. So that was an interesting little bit for
Yeah,
me.
the reason why I asked that because late season, uh, I had shot a bull elk with my bow, and I went out with my son, and he shot his bull elk. So I'm like, oh well, still a little bit of season left. I'll start looking for a bear, and I found a den, and the bear stuck its head out of the den, looked right at
Oh,
me. It was kind of like a pretty steep terrain feature. I kind of feel like that's where they start. They like to dig into shale edges and anything that's loosened up dirt, and they use the existing structure to kind of, because they're lazy, like you say,
yeah.
to give them that shelter without it collapsing in on them. I was just curious about that because of that, because uh, yeah, I was probably like 3-4 feet from that bear, and
Yeah.
it stuck its head out, looked at me, and then went down into that den as far as it could. I kind of crawled in there a little bit to have a look. I don't know how smart that was. I didn't have a hunting partner, but I was trying to see. I'm like, man, I couldn't field judge him obviously, but I went in there and I'm like, whoa. Like this den it's pretty deep. I can't see the end of it. I'm like,
Yeah.
I better wait till the spring to go and get them. But
I've found a couple of dens and they're cool. And I agree with you. Like I think they den up personally. To me, they den up higher up.
yeah.
And they like those avalanche shoots and stuff like that. And actually, now you know what? Now that I think about it, the analogy I was trying to use with the skateboarder earlier was incorrect. I use that for the elevation of bear, not necessarily the sound. So let me go back really quick and correct myself. In the spring is like the skateboarder at the top of the ramp, and then as you go down, the bear go down in elevation. And so as more and more food grows, they go further and further down until you reach the bottom of the half pipe, and then they start to go back up because the berries kind of die out as they go, and then the blueberries are kind of one of the last things, and so the bears kind of go back up the opposite side of that half pipe, and then they den there, and so it's that half pipe motion, and that's the elevation situation. I knew that didn't
Okay.
sound right to me. Now I just kick back.
Hey, you were rolling with it.
Yeah,
It sounded good to me.
yeah, it worked.
No, but I completely agree with you. I call a lot of bull elk in, and that genuine ebbs and flow of that intensity is kind of critical to painting that picture. And I would assume that's the same with bears, where you initially start off kind of probably pretty distressed and then kind of taper off, intensify it, and then like this is a distressed animal that's dying. Eventually they die, so you kind of have to die off the noise, I would assume.
Yeah. And and I'll even throw in, like, if I'm doing a rabbit distress or something, I'll throw in some coyote howls, or
Yeah.
I might even grab some brush and smash it, or get a log and break it, because you know an attack on an animal is kind of loud. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily super quiet. You rattle some brush or whatever without necessarily giving away your position. Um, that's a good thing. And in fact, the very first time I ever called in a bear, I was elk hunting with my bow, and I was trying to call in this bull elk, and I was using a cow call,
Yeah. Me
and a
too.
bear come running right out of a creek draw in hot 90-degree weather, and he came like running right up to me, and I was like, "Holy crap!" This is I called in a bear, and that's kind of what got me into. I got to figure out how to do this more often, because that was a lot of fun. So yeah.
Yeah, that's actually been most of my experience. I'm usually trying to call in elk and I keep having bear encounters. I think it was 2021. I must have called in 10 or 12 bears and they just come
Jeez.
in running, standing up, looking around, crashing through brush. It's pretty exhilarating. I've flung a couple arrows just oh you're calling in elk like, oh, I guess it's a bear hunt now. Now we're hunting
Yeah.
bears. Or I had one where I was calling heavily. I'm sitting there eating lunch in the afternoon, and a bear walks right by me, and then takes off, obviously because they winded me. But yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask you too. Is just as far as like product, like if you were to break the, especially in the spring, into the most productive time periods for either technique, would you say that at the start it's all about terrain and glassing? And at what point do you start looking at, okay, we're seeing probably some calves and does are dropping fawns. What point do you shift to calling, or do they just get harder to call in and harder to see because they get so preoccupied with that, with trying to
In
snatch up smaller prey?
in the early spring, I try to avoid calling, because, well, I don't avoid it, but I will focus more on like what's greening up first,
Yeah.
and then like by mid-April, there's a green, right? There's a lot of green almost everywhere. Um, and so if there's a lot of green, that means there's a lot of food. But I will then start to predator call more, because they're not so concentrated and focused on these little teeny green patches. Now they have green patches everywhere. And so they might be feeding, wherever, but they also might be interested in my fawn distress. And so
Hmm.
that's kind of how that works. Um, yeah.
Yeah, because I've tried to narrow down the most optimal times to try and do these different techniques, because I feel like sometimes if you don't start getting into those areas where you almost have to know where the elk are at and deer are at, to be honest, because I feel like in that later, like towards the end of the season, I've had some really unproductive hunting experience where I'm looking for bears. I just stopped seeing them. Is there any point where you like do you still hunt at the end of the season, or is there a point where it's kind of diminishing returns?
It gets more difficult as the season goes on,
Yeah.
especially after the berries are kind of gone. They just seem to kind of spread out and just kind of
Yeah.
melt away. But to me, that's where predator calling comes in handy too, because you don't know where they're at. There's not a whole lot of food left, but you can still sound like a dinner bell and maybe call something in. And I've called them in right up to the last day of season in mid-November, where there's a foot and a half or more of snow on the ground. And
Hmm.
I called in a double with my brother one time, um, two separate bears, and the one that he shot only had just a little bit of ball of vegetable matter in its stomach. That's one trick, not trick, but a tip that I would tell new bear hunters too, is once you get a bear field dressed, cut that stomach open and take a look at what they're eating, and that will tell you down the road that, hey, this is a protective area. This is what they're eating this time of year. So next year I should be looking for that. And the same
Yeah.
goes for their scat too. If you're having a hard time finding bear, kick their scat, push it with your foot, figure out what type of berries or nuts or seeds or whatever is in that, and then try to find that if it's fresh, if the scat is fresh. So that's another tip.
Awesome. What about field judging? Because obviously you're the expert on bears. What types of cues are you looking for to identify either a boar or a sow or the maturity level? What I'm sure you got tons of tips and tricks for guys.
Yeah, so with male bears, they kind of have broad shoulders, and the older ones they'll have a blocky head and smaller ears on the sides, and sometimes they'll have a muscular crease down the center of their head. And so you're looking for like a blocky head, small ears, broad shoulders, and that walk. They'll have that John Wayne swagger walk to them. And the sows, they have kind of a more pointed face. The nose isn't so blunt. So like on a male boar, that's redundant. On a boar that is older, their snout is kind of short. Female snouts are more elongated, and their head's kind of thinner. The ears might be a little bit taller, but their butt's a little bit bigger too. And they're more narrow in the shoulders. But it's difficult. It's difficult for even someone like me to field judge because ground shrinkage is a real thing to new bear hunters. That is a term that you will find out. You're going to see a bear and shoot it and think, oh man, that thing was huge. And you walk up there and you're like, oh, that was a 120-pound bear. That's not that big. And the very first time I killed a bear, which was by chance when I was deer hunting, I shot this bear that was sitting on its butt, eating maggots off of a dead deer. And when I shot it, I was like, oh, dude, that was a huge bear. And I walked up to it, and it wasn't that big of a bear, but it was a gorgeous hide, which is sitting right next to me on the wall. A nice cinnamon bear. But yeah, that's where I learned that term ground shrinkage. Like it can be hard to tell. You got to take the time to observe them. And if you don't have a lot of time to get out in the field, say, you've only got a week to hunt and you might not see 20, 30 bear to observe them for that long. In my spare time, I will hop on YouTube and watch bear hunting videos just to watch the body movement and the physicality and just the general action of a bear to help me judge, to help me become better at, male bears, female bears, how they react, that type of stuff. So there's other ways other than being out in the field, especially in the off season, that you can help hone your skills in that matter.
How many bears have you shot, Doug?
Dozen, I think, something like that. Not a ton, I guess, but I've been involved in probably well over 20. Probably
Why don't you tell
24,
the
I think,
listeners
with my
about your
brothers
most?
and my dad.
Why don't you tell the listeners about your most memorable hunt?
Taking a drink. They're all memorable in my opinion. They all have their interesting ones. That the first bear that I shot, like I was saying, when I shot it, it died in that pile of maggots, and so when we had to take it out, it absolutely reeked. It was rolling in this, dead, rotted corpse, and so we got it out. But that was fun. One of my favorite stories is, and it's the cover animal on the old guide to black bear hunting. But I was up in Alaska, and I was predator calling. So me and my buddy, we were up there. He wasn't hunting. He's a guy I grew up with, and he was just taking photos. But we see this bear outside of camp. We climb up on this rocky bluff, and I'm like, well, I'm gonna try to predator call it down. And I'm in this rocky bluff. Before us is this little creek down below, and then there's this big hillside with real tall brush, but there's little patches of open ground that you can see, and that bear was in that ground. And so I started predator calling with a jackrabbit distressed, by the way, and there's not a jackrabbit within Alaska, so that's another example of it doesn't have to be a local animal. And the bear started coming down through the brush, so I lost sight of it. And then I keep calling, and then another bear comes down through that brush, through the open area that bear was just in, and keeps coming. And I said to my friend, I go, man, there's two of them. And these animals are only like 300-400 yards at best from us when we're seeing them. And I keep calling another 5-10 minutes, and I look to my right, and there's this coyote running through the creek with a dead salmon in its mouth, and it's like just taking the hell out of there and looking back at me like, what the hell's going on? So he's running with this dead salmon. And when I'm looking at him, another bear comes running through the creek, and I was like, holy crap, there's three of them. And so this third bear come down from my far right and ended up coming around the horn, basically coming up, and I shot it on the run at like maybe 20 yards. Just I normally don't take headshots, but that was the only shot I had, and I hit it dead center, and it just piled up. But that was crazy because I called in a triple, and that within like it was 5-10 minutes, like it was a quick set. But there was just like bear all over the freaking place, and that was really cool. My first triple, and a beautiful, beautiful topography. I mean, I had this massive glacier to my right. It was kind of stormy weather. My buddy was there. It was just a lot of fun. And then another time, my brother shot a bear. We were up hunting, and we had split up. I heard a shot. I went back to meet him. I says, "Hey, what happened?" He goes, "Oh, I shot this bear, but it was walking really funny." And I says, "Well, did you hit it?" He goes, "Yeah." And so we were looking for this bear. And then in the brush, I happened to find it, and I says, "Well, I can tell you why it's walking funny." He says, "Why?" And it only had 3 legs. It wasn't. He didn't blow the arm off or nothing, but it was just born. It like right above the elbow joint, basically. It didn't have the rest of its legs, so it had this like, it had a massive like, I think it was its left. Like when we skinned it, his left arm was just like a bruiser left arm, just because he's doing one arm push-ups his whole life. But he was a healthy bear. Like wasn't nothing. He was a great bear, and he has that half mounted in my dad's house, so that's a cool bear. But yeah, I've called in lots of bears. I've lost a couple, and that happens. Bears are tough, man.
Yeah.
A tip for people is, especially new bear hunters, is if you hit a bear and you're not finding a lot of bud, don't sweat it. Just keep looking, keep tracking, because that bear hair and their fat will kind of plug that hole, so they won't bleed as much as like a deer or an elk that has a really smooth coat of hair and not as thick as a bear's and not as much fat. So really work and track and find that bear.
What's your go-to kill zone spot? Where are you always trying to aim for?
I call it like the armpit. So kind of, people will say the shittle, the middle of the middle, and the shoulder, and it all just kind of depends. I don't like to shoot the shoulder to break it. I kind of aim like right behind it and a little bit lower. So the middle of the middle and then down just a touch. That's just me. That's what's worked for me. I don't like frontal shots. I've lost one bear on a frontal shot. I don't like them. But again, this is just me. There's a lot of people who love frontal shots, and then that's great. So yeah, just kind of that armpit area. If you blow something's lungs out, it's not going to go too far. But I have shot a bear in the heart, blew its heart out, and the thing still ran 40 yards through 8-foot tall blackberries, and so they're just, they're incredible creatures. How it can run without a heart is beyond me, but it did.
As far as like caliber choices, what do you recommend? Like, is there a certain point where you're like, okay, I would shoot at this minimum level just for what you
The gun I have in my hand is what I'm after.
Yeah.
No. No, so if you have a gun that you use for deer hunting,
yeah,
that's probably going to be sufficient for your average North American black bear. Some people are like, "Oh, I got to get a, 45-70 or something," and that's great too if you want that, but the rifle I use most often is I have a 300 Winchester short magnum. That just happens what I use for deer and what I use for bear. I bow hunt for elk, so it doesn't count for them. But I'll bring a 30-30. I think mainly it's about kind of shot placement and a quality bullet. So, you don't use some crappy cheap box bullet when you're hunting any animal really. You want a nice quality bullet that's going to retain its weight and not just shatter on arrival. You want something that's going to be devastating and hold its bullet mass. So I use like Hornady's, I do a 165 grain. So that's what I shoot out of the 300. And there, a lot of people are ballistic people. I'm not. I think it's more about shot placement, and most of my shots are like well under 100 yards. Most of them are like 50 yards. So I'm not the type of guy to shoot, and I'm not saying against it, but I'm not the type of guy to shoot 400 or 500 yards at a bear.
Yeah.
If I'm poking 200 yards at a deer, that's a long shot for me. It's just because it's not that I can't shoot it. It's just that I like to get close. I like to be as close as possible when I shoot. So
What's your top of the list piece of gear when you're going out hunting for bears? Like, what is something that's in your mind critical to success?
I always have a predator call around my neck, and I probably have one in my pack too. So that's something that I always bring with me, other than my gun and stuff like that. But to
Yeah.
me, that's important. And second to that is a knife or a quality knife set with a sharpener, because I don't know what it is. I don't know the scientific reasoning behind it, but bear hair seems to really dull the hell out of knives. And so when you're skinning those bears and your hands are all greasy and stuff, it doesn't take that long to kind of dull that knife. And so, Havalon you can switch out the blades, and there's other knives nowadays that you can switch out those razor sharp blades, and those are definitely handy. I've done many a bear with Havalon. But a good knife sharpener, taking the time to rest, get a drink of water, sharpen your knife, that's important when you're doing. You don't want to have a dull knife and slip and then cut yourself in the back 40 and have a major problem. So
Are you
take
you
your
looking
time.
for like a fine tip blade then for when you're caping out?
So,
Is that what you're looking
so
for typically?
yeah, so I actually carry a bone saw, and I carry like a skinning knife, and then like a gutting knife. I just have that in my pack in general.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'll have like my Havalon with the little various blades that you can interchange. So my initial cuts, I mean, I've done whole bears with just the thin blade of a Havalon lots of times. But I'll use kind of a broader blade sometimes when I'm skinning it. It just depends on the situation. Um, yeah, it just depends.
Do you have any tips for like fur care? Because like I know some guys will in high heat they'll how they bundle up their hides. It can really mean the difference between the quality of that hide. Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, so you want to get it dry and cool as quickly as possible. So if it's and so that's something you want to consider. If you're 50 years old and you're 4 miles back and it's 90 degrees out, you might want to think about maybe not shooting that bear if the hide's important to you, because it might be a while before you get that bear out, and that
Yeah.
hide can start to slip. But if you're 20 and you're 3 miles in and you're healthy, have at it. That's something to consider. Tip wise, keep it dry, keep it clean as you can, and get it cooled as quickly as you can. So once you get the hide off and hang it for a bit or something, if you're gonna be deboning, hang it out, let it air out. Don't just ball it up around the skull, because that
Yeah.
skull, your head, you're retaining a lot of heat in your head.
Yeah.
And so that brain is still in there. There's a lot of heat, and all that heat will just radiate. So you want that skull, the head on the outside of it. So fold it up, roll it up a little bit, but have the head on the outside, and then get it to the fridge or the freezer or the cooler as quick as you can. And then to the taxidermist if you're going to take it to them. Put it in a don't drive around for 3 hours showing your friends, in a
Yeah.
black garbage sack in the back of your truck. Take care of that hide quickly you can. Those are kind of my tips.
What about when you're rolling it up? Are you putting skin to skin and then rolling it with the high like the fur on the exterior, and then you just
Yeah,
rolling it up like a sleeping bag?
yes, that's kind of how I do it. So I'll fold it skin to skin and then roll it up and then have the head on the outside. Um, that's the way I've done it. And some taxidermists might tell you otherwise or whatever, and some people prefer it certain ways. But yeah, that's the way I've done it.
How far
I'm
up the
sorry. Another
brisket do
another
you
thing.
go?
I go up probably 3/4 of the way, almost to the throat, maybe a little less. But it depends on on your mount, right?
Yeah.
Um, so if you're gonna do a full mount, I talk about how to do that in the book and whatever. And actually, a lot of taxidermists even have printouts that you can go online and just, hey, these are the cuts that we want, because some are very particular about it, some aren't. Some don't mind to cut up the center, but if you're gonna have a bear standing up, you don't necessarily want to cut it up the center. You might want to do it at the back. Um, there's just a couple of different ways you can do it. So that's a good thing too, is for new guys to either talk to your taxidermist or go online, and like Meat Eater has some good videos on how to skin out a bear. Um, so if you can take the time, if you've never done it before, that's a good how-to. Um, and the same with the claws and the head. So if you're not familiar with skinning that stuff out, when you skin out the bear, leave the claws and the hand, leave the paws attached. So you basically just cut the wrist, but leave that all that fur and stuff attached with the hand or the claw inside. The taxidermist can take that out. And it's the same with the head. You want the head inside. If you've never skinned a face um, of a bear, that it can be kind of delicate around the eyes, the eyelids, the mouth, all that stuff. So don't feel bad about leaving that skull in there and having the taxidermist do it. Most of them would
Mm-hmm.
probably prefer they do it and not
Yeah.
have you create more work for them.
If you are going to do it yourself, how far up on the gum line do you go? Like what's your, because I would presume it's a lot like a mule deer where you want to try and get as much of that gum line before you work your way up to the eyes.
Yeah, so I kind of peel it back from the head, and then I throw the hide over the head. I work from the back of the head all the way forward, and so then I find the ears and I cut those real close to the skull as I
Yeah.
can. And then I peel that back, and then you peel down the nose, and you cut real close to the bone on the nose, and then you're basically stuck with the lips and the chin there. And I do it. I'll have a thin blade in this situation. I have one of those Havilon little razors, and as close as you can to the lip. Well, I suppose you went down around the eyes, but you gotta be careful around the eyes so you don't cut off the lids and stuff. But
Yeah.
mouth as close as you can, right around those lips, the gum line, just as close and as tight as you can. That's the way I've done it. So
They don't have any tricky spots like on tear ducks, do they?
no, the the nose the nose isn't that bad. Even the mouth isn't that bad. To me, the
Yeah.
the trickiest spot are just really the eyes, and that's only because of the eyelids.
Yeah.
Um, it's not that bad once you've seen it done, or once you get a little bit of experience. It's not that bad at all. Actually, now that I think about it, trying to skin around the front wrists is kind of a pain in the butt, because you're trying to leave them attached, but you're trying to get the rest of that hide, and so there's it's just kind of a cluster right there. I mean, yeah, you cut through the wrist and you pop that wrist off. Trying to skin that whole little spot, that takes a little bit of time. That's kind of a pain in the
Yeah.
butt.
Yeah, I'd presume it'd be kind of slow and tedious just because you don't want to wreck the hide, and it's
Yeah,
probably
and
thin.
I'll tell this to deer hunters too, but when you're cutting those initial cuts and whatnot, don't put the blade against the hair. Put the blade kind of, you poke it into the belly and then work your way up. So instead of against the hair, cutting the hair, that creates more of a mess. If you poke into there and then work your way up, so the blade's kind of facing you and you're just working that cut, that's the good way to do it.
What about meat care? Is there any tips and tricks for meat care? Because I would presume with like the amount of fat that it has, are you making sure that obviously it needs to have a good crust or drying out, or is it pretty much the same as any other game that you've quartered up?
I try to get that as cool and as dry and clean as possible, as quickly as possible. That bear fat seems to kind of turn faster than like deer or elk tallow.
Yeah.
So getting that stuff cooled is a good idea. And that all depends on the weather. Weather's different in the spring than it is in August, and the same with September and October, November. I've even had some butchers, and I've done this a couple times, and even I've done this with elk and stuff, but you get those hams off, those back hams, and I'll do a cut down them because they'll get cooler on the outside, right? But they'll retain all that heat by the bone, and then they'll start to rot. So if
I
you
was
can
just going to ask you that. Yeah.
yeah, if you can debone it, that's great. Or at the minimum, do a cut down there to try to air that out a little bit. And steel wool is kind of a handy thing. If you get some hair on there, that man, for those who aren't familiar, man, bear grease, bear fat, it's just like putting your hand on like Crisco butter and then trying to work with something. It's just slippery and wet, but and so hair is attached to it really easy. But if you can get some steel wool and just a one direction, just start scrubbing that stuff down, it takes off that hair pretty well, and so that keeps it clean for the butcher, and they'll appreciate that most of the time.
So is that pretty much the problem area when you're encountering extreme heat would be in those hinds on like right up in that right on the bone?
Yeah, big chunks of meat, those hindquarters. You can get the back straps off fairly quick and cool those, but the shoulders and the rump especially, that's where there's a lot of meat. So and the neck too, but you can most people part out the neck. I have seen to where people will cut the head off and then and they'll have like a neck roast and just leave it bone in. I haven't done that. Most of the time I just part out all that stuff, but yeah, any big chunks of meat, try to let that hang for a little bit, let it cool off, then put it in the bag. Don't just take it off, put it in the bag, grab another chunk, put it in the bag, because that it's just retaining that heat. If you can let it air cool a little bit prior, that's a good idea. But depends on the weather. Try to keep it in the shade. You don't want it sitting in the direct sun, that type of stuff. Pretty basic hunter stuff.
And what's your go-to for what you're using your meat for? Are you going to primarily can it or create tallow, or are you just after you take your hams off or are you curing it, smoking it? What's your go-to? What's your favorite?
I like roasts. I actually I do a lot of summer sausage. So I'll do like jalapeno and high temp cheese summer sausage, or pep sticks. And that's kind of a good little snack. I used to so I still have a son, but he doesn't live here anymore. He's 20 now, turns 21 in a couple of weeks. So the summer sausage was a good snack for a hungry teenager, right? You take that out, thawed out, and cheese and crackers, and that's an easy fix. I like bear fajitas. There's a whole subculture in the hunting world on bear recipes and what to use for bear fat and all sorts of stuff. So you can go down quite the rabbit hole on different recipes for bear. I mean, you can use it for like you would anything else. I've had bear burgers, roasts, fajitas, stir fry, all sorts of fun stuff. So, but my favorite is probably the pep sticks and summer sausage.
Do you have any guidelines for like meat safety for trichinosis?
So this is another rabbit hole. I always tell people to fully cook it, but there are ways that I have seen that people swear up and down that you can eat like medium or like medium rare bear meat. I personally am not going to risk it.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily want, it's not that important to me to have a piece of
no, me neither.
Medium rare bear meat. Then I'd rather have it well done. That's just me. So yeah, cook it. Or I've also read that if it's frozen under a certain degree for X amount of months, that kills it. But don't quote me on that. So cooking is the best remedy.
What about your bear grease? What are you using it for?
So, a lot of people, they do cracklings. They'll cube up the stuff. They'll render it down, and then they, fry little chunks of meat. I haven't done that a lot. A lot of people can their bear fat after it's rendered. They use it for cooking and pastries and all sorts of stuff. I am not that good of a chef. I make, kind of basic stuff. But there's plenty of people out there with plenty of recipes, and there's a million uses for bear fat. There really is. People use it to waterproof boots. I've even seen where some guy had some sort of a weather predictor to tell barometer measurements with bear grease somehow or another. So there's a million things you can use for it. I don't necessarily use a lot of it, and I'll probably get some flack for that. But I mean, I even talk about it in the book. Like, some people really like it. I just don't really mess with it. But it's white gold. Like, a lot of people, they'd probably tie me up if they knew that I didn't use it all the time. But it's just not my thing.
Yeah, I will say that typically if you're using it in pastries, I know my grandmother used to use bear grease growing up, and I have some friends that use it as well for pastries. You don't want to use it with any type of like fruit pie or anything sweet like that. It kind of, I'm not saying it's off-putting, but I think it's more favored towards like shepherd's pies, stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I'm down for a
'cause-
shepherd's pie, man.
yeah.
Meat and potatoes. That's my jam.
Yeah, yeah. Not that it's off-putting, but I've had friends that say, "Yeah, we made some like apple pie, and it just was just a little different."
Yeah. Yeah.
Wasn't that it wasn't good, it's just a little bit different.
It's an acquired taste.
Yeah, exactly. Acquired taste.
Yeah.
Well, Doug, it's always a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah,
This
man.
is
Thanks for having
great
me.
information for people. I think as far as like when I think about hunting, at least in the last 2 or 3 years, bear hunting has just exploded. I think that's probably like one of the biggest subcultures in hunting that is just exploding. Guys are really getting after it. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on the show. And why don't you let the listeners know where they can see what you're up to and maybe get a hold of your book?
Yeah. So you can find the book online pretty much anywhere, but I usually just tell people Amazon. They have it for $19.99. It's the ultimate guide to black bear hunting, and it's got, it's by Douglas Boze. There is like a Chinese knockoff that's on Audible, I think, that it has the same name but a different cover, and some other guy's AI created book. But anyway, Ultimate Guide to Black Bear Hunting, Doug Boze. You can find me on Instagram at Boze and Bears, Boze and Bears. I'm on Facebook. If you want to be on that, that's just kind of my personal thing. That's Douglas Boze as well. And that's about it. I always tell people, like, if you're new to bear hunting or something like that, and you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on my Instagram or wherever, and I will try to answer your questions and help you out. I'm more than happy to do that. I appreciate everyone's support. I also have I have apps too. So I have some predator calling apps called Ultimate Predator Calls, and that's recordings of me calling. And so you can use that app on your phone and push it to a Bluetooth speaker if it's legal in your area to use electronic calls. And I'd be predator calling for you. And so I've had people calling cougars and bears and bobcats, all sorts
Awesome.
of fun stuff with that stuff. Yeah, and that's like $4.99 on the App Store on Apple. So
Awesome. And I'm going to do this for the fans of the show. If the first person that sends me a DM with the time of your story about your triple, I'm going to send them one of your books.
nice, man. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
And congrats to the winner.
Yeah. Congrats to the winner. All right, guys. Thank you. And as always, let's get after it.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.
See ya.